Hey, what's up, everybody? Travis Ballinghoff here. So, a lot of you probably know, if you do not, I usually hop on the Flyers High and Wide podcast once a week. And last night we interviewed Bill Meltzer. Bill Meltzer has been covering the Flyers for a very long time and does great work. And in our interview with him last night, we talked about Morgan Frost and his contract situation, why that may not have gotten done yet. We also talked about Ivan Fedotov, Carter Hart, the goaltending situation that's going on right now. And training camp's about 5 weeks away. We talked about some guys who may make the team, who may be on their way out of the lineup, getting pushed out by maybe some rookies. We talked about a lot in this interview. So first, I am going to leave the link for the full podcast. That'll be in the description down below on the first line. Make sure you check out the full podcast over on High and Wide's channel. A lot of good Flyers talk over there. But without further ado, here is our interview that we did with Bill Meltzer.
Our guest has popped in, Mr. Bill Meltzer. Bill, how are you?
I'm doing well. How about you guys?
We're doing okay. We're talking Fedotov. We're talking Alex Bump. We're down to our August topics. You know what I mean?
yeah. Dog days of the summer.
Yeah. How's your summer been, Bill?
It's been good. I'm up back in Philly ahead of training camp right now. The Flyers alumni's fantasy camp starts this weekend. So back here, appreciating nicer weather. It's rained a bit, but in Texas, there's been a whole string of about 45 days in a row over 100 degrees, as high as 110. So I'll take some rain.
This is cool for you down here, then high 80s, low 90s. It's like fall for you, huh? All right, so let's get into it a little bit. We're, as we mentioned, middle of August, and Morgan Frost is not signed yet. We all know that you're one of his bigger advocates. You're one of his biggest supporters, it seems like. Can you kind of tell us maybe what's going on with the Frost situation? Is he eventually going to sign, or what's the holdup here?
Yeah, I'd be shocked if he's not in camp on day one. Not totally surprised that we're getting to the middle of August, and I wouldn't be surprised if we're sitting around Labor Day saying when is it going to get done. But I expect it to be done ahead of camp. I think they'll ultimately come to some kind of a compromise. I think more likely on another 1-year deal, and then figure it out again next offseason. The complication here is that Morgan's season last year was basically 2 seasons. There was the first 27 games where he spent a stretch on the fourth line. He was scratched a game. I think he only had 5 or 6 points in those first 27 games. And then over the final 55 games, he led the team in scoring. So which season do you pay him based on, right? At some point they'll come to a number they agree on. But that, I think, is what makes a multi-year deal kind of tough. And even going in, you didn't want to do a 3-year deal because that walks him right to being an unrestricted free agent. So you're looking at 2 or 4 with a 1-year deal kind of being, the compromise where I think they're gonna end up. And then next offseason, you go through it again where he's potentially eligible for arbitration. So if he has a big year, then that could be a very interesting negotiation. It'll work out. It'll work out at some point, but it's just I think it's newsworthy because he's the last guy who's unsigned.
Yeah. So I was wondering this, and maybe you kind of just answered it. Was he not eligible for arbitration this summer?
He was not eligible for arbitration this summer. Yeah. If you remember that when he was on his entry level deal, he missed a year. He missed a whole year. With the shoulder surgery. And the year before that, because of COVID, the season stopped in March.
Wow.
So he didn't have enough games in to although he was a restricted free agent, he was what they call a 1002C. So in other words, he wasn't eligible for an offer sheet from another team. He could only sign with the Flyers this past summer. And so he's kind of, for those purposes, a first-time restricted free agent, which means he didn't have arbitration rights. But he would next offseason.
So if he signed a 1-year deal, would he be arbitration eligible next season?
He would next summer. He would be, yes.
Interesting.
He's had one of the most weirdest paths to where he is now, hasn't he? Like we had the COVID and he had the injury year, and it's just been so weird. He finally had some consistency last year, playing for the Flyers for the entire year. Obviously, first time under John Tortorella, new coach. Adjustment period, first couple months, same for any player, but especially a guy like Frost, because let's be honest, last year was his first year where you knew he was going to be with the Flyers, right? There was not going to be any bouncing back and forth, and I think, like you mentioned, Billy, he finally caught on at some point in the season, and he had 2 4-point games, right, against Phoenix, but still a 4-point game in the NHL. I guess his side maybe wants a longer deal, or is he doing, or do you think that they're looking for a 1-year deal as well, sort of like a prove it, and maybe they're just not coming to terms on a number?
I think that, I think that the player will bet on himself ultimately, but
I like that.
I mean, I think that probably the starting point was we'll go 2 years. But what number do you arrive at for 2 years? Because when you do that, a piece of that is based upon past performance, but it's also projecting what he's going to do in upcoming seasons. With last season, really, to me, it was a matter of 2 things: opportunity and confidence. And Morgan was not the most self-confident player until he tasted some success, and then he just. And then he knew if he screwed a play up, had a turnover, whatever, whatever Torts had to say about him over the season, the bottom line is he kept sending him over the boards for his next shift.
Yep.
And, so once they moved him up in the lineup at the end of November, beginning of December, he played pretty regularly after that. And that's really all a player can ask for, is that opportunity. And then when he had some success, and he had the 2 4-point games, but I mean, overall, he led the team in scoring, led them in assists, led them in even strength scoring. Because he didn't the team as a whole was pretty bad in the power play. But if you break Morgan's season down, almost all of his production was even strength. So he actually had a lot of even strength points. If he would have had even kind of semi-normal power play production, you're looking at 55, 60 points. So in a good power play. But so that's kind of all those things they're sorting out. Okay, well, he struggled for a time. There are still areas where they'd like to see a little bit more consistency, where he still has room to grow. That takes time to come to a number. The next step, I think, is one side or the other has to move. One side or other has to come back and exchange and put a new number forward, and then the other side will counter, and that's when they'll come to an agreement. As far as I understand, there has not been, at least as last I heard, which is now a week or 2 ago, there hadn't been any new numbers exchanged since early in the off season. So, sometimes teams have to feel that urgency. When camp is around the corner, there is that urgency. So if I think once you get to Labor Day, and certainly any time after Labor Day, especially as players start to report early, which happens every year. Morgan did spend some time in Voorhees this summer. But, obviously he's not going to report without a contract. I think as guys start coming in, he's going to feel some urgency. Flyers are still pretty thin at center. They need him. He needs to get going and to have a good season. So I think that when that sense of, okay, we need to get something done kicks in is when you'll see it.
Saw that with Konechny in 2019.
Yeah, exactly.
I wanted to ask you a little bit, and hopefully this is in the past and we don't have to worry about this anymore, but you mentioned Morgan Frost's usage, and nothing against any of these players, but a couple years ago he was playing with Mayhew and Willman. This past season we saw him play with Delorier and McEwen, and you look at a guy like Frost and I don't really see him producing in that kind of role. It's kind of like the chicken or the egg. Excuse me, do we give a guy the ice time who has the skill like Frost does, or do we put him on a 4th line role and really make him earn that ice time in a role that he might not produce in? I'm curious where you kind of stand on that.
Well, I mean, I think that ultimately Now, I go back to something, a famous quote by Fred Shero. When in doubt, there's a Fred Shero quote for it. Fred Shero used to say that if I don't put a player in position to succeed, where he's able to do what he does best, and he fails, that's on the coach. If I give the player the opportunity, a skilled guy put him on the power play, a physical guy put him on a checking line, whatever the case might be, and he doesn't take advantage of that opportunity, then that's on the player. So I think there's a shared thing in this a little bit. Mm-hmm. I mean, Morgan did have short stretches with skill around them previously, and I mean, honestly, he showed some hints of producing. They never really stuck with it though. His longest stretch, as you said, season before last was it was with Mayhew, I believe, and with Max Willman, were his most regular line mates the season before. And no offense to those guys who are talented hockey players and very good American League guys, but those aren't the kind of line mates that are going to be conducive to producing regularly, particularly if you're getting the 11th most power play time, not this past season, but the season before that. That's hard. And this year when he had that stretch of 10 games where he only had 1 point during those 10 games, he's playing 8 to 10 minutes on the fourth line and no power play time. That's hard on any player. But it's also there are things the coaches want to see you do more consistently. With the case of season before last, he heard over and over, and he knew it, but I think he needed to just commit to it, was about moving his feet more consistently. I think he did that this year. But there's also, you add to those the things that Torts wants, right? Making defensive plays out of the corner, for example. Making sure that also keeping his feet moving early in the season, making sure he gets sufficient puck touches, those kind of things. The things that you want to see from a guy who's going to play on the upper end of the lineup. And it took some time, and he started doing that. So I think the best answer to that is that there's a bit of a shared responsibility to that. But I've said this numerous times to many people, that I do think usage was a part of what held down his production until he got that extended opportunity with guys like Tippett last year.
Yeah, I agree with you.
For sure. Okay, so we have a couple other questions outside of Frost. Trav and Jack, you want to fire away there?
I'll start us off. I guess camp's in hopefully 5 weeks. Any young guys you could see making a push for the opening night roster that maybe fans aren't looking at right now?
I think there's a few. The big names are out there. Obviously, Forster probably has a really good shot at opening season with the team. I'm really curious to see how, he's an NHLer at this point, but to see, can Wade Allison stay healthy, right? Does he have a spot in the top 12? Because right now, if you look at the numbers, he might be number 13 on the forward depth chart.
That's a great point.
Now he'll have something to say about that, with his play. In terms of guys that maybe are a little under the radar, Bobby Brink had the hip surgery last year and missed the first half of the season. And when he came back to the Phantoms in the second half, I'd say it took him until late in the season to start looking like himself again. So while he's not waiver eligible this season, he's waiver exempt for one more year, so they can send him down to the Phantoms without worrying about getting through waivers. He has a skill level where if he has a big camp, he could end up on the opening night roster. I don't want to just write off a player with his skill level. Ronnie Attard he's also waiver exempt this year, and while I think the odds right now favor him going back to the Phantoms, the organization likes him. I mean, they brought him right to the NHL from college hockey. Burn that first year, as you have to do with when you sign college players. Had an all-star season in the American League. Still working on some defensive things, but he's getting there. I wouldn't write him off yet as not having a shot at the opening night roster. He's competing with guys like Emil Andrae. He's competing, maybe a guy like Yinning. Certainly with Zamula, who would have to go through waivers to go down to the Phantoms. So I think there's an open competition going in. And the last thing I'll put out, sometimes you have guys who, well, actually, I'll put one more out first. Elliot Denoyer being an example of a guy. Hey, you know what? He led the Phantoms in scoring last year as a rookie. He's a two-way player, held his own, I think, in most of the 4 games he played in the NHL last year. Can play down in the lineup if you need that, be a penalty-killing speed guy. I think he'll see NHL games this year, whether it's at the start of the season or not, remains to be seen. But as a second-year pro, maybe he starts with the Phantoms. But I wouldn't say it's a lock. I'd say that he has a shot going in. And the last thing I'll put out there is Ole Liksell is a guy really under the radar. He has a history of being a fast starter, and he had a great camp last year and didn't miss the roster by much. He was one of the last guys to get cut. And if he does that again, you never know. Has a good camp. There's an injury or two. Then all of a sudden, maybe he's in the mix for at least for opening night.
You mentioned Emil Andrae. We had the conversation last week, and we couldn't find a straight answer. If he gets cut and doesn't make the opening night roster, does he have to go back to Sweden, or can he go to the AHL?
Okay, so there's a transfer agreement between the NHL and the Swedish Hockey Federation.
Okay.
There was a new transfer agreement that was signed in 2022. So some of the rules changed last year. And if a player is a first-round pick, then you can send him up and down between the NHL and the AHL as many times as you can, as long as he's waiver exempt. So now Andrae was a second-round pick, so he falls under the other set of rules. So as the way the new rules are, his Swedish team, HV71, would have the final say on if he's not in the NHL. The NHL always takes priority. Mm-hmm. But if the Flyers want to send him to the Phantoms, they have his Swedish team has the say of, okay, we want him back for the season, or you can make or you can come to some kind of an agreement that they'll loan him to the Phantoms for the year. So the rules say he would have to go back to Sweden. But it also, there's wiggle room to make some kind of a deal if the two sides are agreeable to that. And if and the Flyers say to the Swedish team, listen, he might not be ready to start the season in the NHL, but we think he can be ready by November, December. I don't think they'd stand in his way. But if they go, he might need another year. We'd like him in the American League. The Swedish team might go, well, we need him too, and we'd like him here this season. So I think that. That all remains to be seen how it goes in camp. I would say that if he doesn't make the team, I would say it's about 70-30 that he does go back to Sweden, but it's not set in stone.
Interesting. Last one I have for you. As of today, Carter Hart's on the team. He hasn't been traded. He's the number 1 goalie on your depth chart. Who would you say is number 2?
Well, good question. If they some of it depends on Fedotov, how all that shakes out. When the Flyers extended Ursen's deal for 2 seasons, it wasn't solely because of this season. Some of it's also a commitment to him saying, regardless of where you play this season, we like you. We see you as a guy who's going to have an NHL career, be part of our plans. We're extending you now with kind of a show of good faith. And if the season's not right now, where Fedotov is still up in the air and who the heck knows where he's going, then I would say Ursen is number 2. I think Peterson is gonna have to either significantly outplay Ursen, or just have a real good bounce back in the American League. You can't bury his whole contract at $5 million. You can only bury about 1.1 million of it in the American League, and the rest is still going to count against your cap. Peterson's in a lot of ways playing for his career. he has 2 years signed, but if he has a year this year like his last 2 have been, he's a buyout candidate next year, and you just you get to take the 1 year of cap relief and you eat whatever the remainder is in the other year. But that's a guy who wants to get back in the league. He's still relatively young at 28, but he's got a little bit, he's got a lot to prove too. He's got a little bit of an uphill battle. He wasn't even that good in the American League last year with Ontario. So I think that he's got a lot to show. Unfortunately, Felix Sandstrom had his opportunity last year. That was his time to shine. And Felix was prone to that one bad goal and had no goal support either. That didn't help either, because it felt like he let one bad one in and they'd lose 3-2, or they lose 4-3, or whatever the case might be. Wins were really hard for Felix to come by last year. But that was his time where Urson was coming off of injury, where there wasn't a veteran he was really competing with. He had the backup job to Hart most of the year, except for when he went down, needed some conditioning time and whatnot. So right now Felix has a real uphill battle on his hands, and if Fedotov comes over, I wonder if they don't agree to some kind of termination where he could go back to Europe for the year, or deal into an organization that where he might have a role. The Flyers were reluctant about waiving him last year. They may have been concerned that Pittsburgh would claim him when Ron Hextall was a GM there, because Hexie had brought in guys who he originally drafted in Philly, like Mark Friedman as an example. So they weren't just going to give him away for nothing. They wanted to give him a chance. But I think in the group of 4, if you exclude Fedotov, Felix right now is the it's the number 4 guy in that mix behind Hart, Urson, and Peterson. Fedotov coming over, if he were to come over, now he's missed a full year. If he came with the Flyers, he wouldn't have to miss additional time. Only if he goes to the KHL would he miss another half of a season. That's part of the thought process too. As hard as it is for a player in his prime to miss a year and a half is hard. Really hard. A position like goalie. I haven't played any competitive hockey. So, but I think Fedotov might go do some conditioning time. If he were to make the team, just get him some starts in the American League. And we'll see what happens with Carter. But ultimately, hopefully by fairly early in the season, if he were to start playing now, Fedotov could be ready. But he's a question mark about his availability still. So I think you set him aside and you go, right now you're thinking Urson, Peterson, Sandstrom's the backups.
Right on.
Bill, I don't want to hold you for too long, but I just wanted to ask more so about Allison's game. Everything we've seen from him and what we've liked about him in the past, he seems like a different player. Now, what is your analysis on that? Is he worried that his typical way of playing will get him hurt and out of the lineup, and that'll ultimately lead to him maybe not being able to stick with the team, and that's affected his game? Where do you stand with him?
I think that with Wade, the injuries are always in the back of your mind. I think the biggest adjustment with him, and he had go rounds with Torts about it last year, and you've seen Wade with the Phantoms and even before that with the Flyers. He likes to try some East-West plays, and and not just be a north-south grind along the boards guy. And Torts is insistent, draw a line. He said, you'll East-West yourself right out of my lineup. So, so player's not going to win that. He had to adjust to playing north-south and along the walls. And I thought that once he finally got somewhat healthy, he did that pretty effectively. He goes to the net well. He has the grit, the physical side to his game. Really, it's just been so hard for him to stay in the lineup, and he's in his mid-20s now. He's not a kid anymore. So I think that right now, if you were to pencil a lineup, if everybody's healthy, which is rarely the case, there's always injuries. Assuming Forster does make the team, I think right now Wade is your number 13 forward as a winger. I think there might be there might be some wiggle room in fourth line center if Paling doesn't come in and do what he's supposed to do. Then something that could open the door for a guy like Denoyer maybe to they like as a center. But Wade is strictly a winger, and more naturally plays on the right side. They're a little overloaded on the right side, so I think it comes down to pleasing Torts, playing the way Torts wants him to play, which he's shown he can do, and eventually those things work themselves out. He just needs to avoid, just running himself into the stanchion or hurting his knee again, or sometimes Wade's been his worst enemy, playing a little out of control, and then other times it's just been sheer bad luck. I mean, dude has had just awful luck, injury wise. So but any which way you slice it, he has to stay healthy, show he can be relied on in the lineup, and he's not going to be out for 6 weeks twice a season. And if he can do that, then I think there may be a role for him. What he does, the things he does well, there's not a lot of guys who do on the team. That helps him. Still can score, still can go to the net a little bit and offer those things too. But I think that he doesn't come to camp with a job to lose. He has to win a job still. So I think that he's a little bit on the bubble.
So we're mentioning a couple of names of these guys have been around for a little bit as prospects, haven't really broken through to prove they're NHL regulars. We're also a young rebuilding team. We're adding more and more names. Is there anybody that you're starting to think like they might not have a future here? It might be a little early on some of these guys, but Allison was a good example. He still got something to prove. Guys like Zamula, guys like Ginning, like guys like that. Are these new prospects starting to push these guys aside in a sense? And maybe this year might be the last year for them to make an impression on the front office, the new front office?
Well, I'm Ginning is a little bit of an exception because he kind of came to the Phantoms last year, although he was a second-round pick originally, with not a lot of expectations, and he had a surprisingly good year as a defensive defenseman. I still personally think he needs to get a little bit better with the puck to have an NHL job. One of the Flyers' biggest needs, besides the defensive coverage side of it, is moving the puck. They have to move the puck better, and that's an area where I think he still has room to get better. Long term, if he can do that to a moderate degree, I think there might be a third pairing role for him. If not this season, then the following season. But there's not a ton of runway either because it wasn't like he was just picked a year ago, So I think that they liked what they saw last year, but if he has a future, I think he's going to have to build on a little bit further. So there's not a ton of time left, with him. Zamula, as you mentioned, I mean he's waiver eligible this year. Flyers originally signed him as an undrafted rookie free agent, so that but he's had a number of years here where he's had some looks in the NHL, and at times has looked like he belongs. Other times I think he's still been a little in over his head. So I think it has to be this year, and he has to start showing it quickly, which I don't know if that's entirely fair because he is coming off of another surgery, but but he doesn't have the luxury of time. He has to show something, pretty quickly here. Tanner Lazinski's another one who he's had just talk about rotten luck with injuries. He had one hip and then the other hip, right? And then, but he certainly did not impress Torts last year. Torts he was pretty deep in Torts' doghouse. Not too deep, not too far into the season, and never really got out of there. I think he might benefit from a change of scenery. I don't know that that there's a spot for him right now, barring injuries or barring a big camp. So Tanner would be a guy I'd put in the now or never category. Guys can show things in spells, and then things change the next camp. If you remember last year going into camp, Isaac Ratcliffe had that 10-game stretch in the NHL the year before, and he didn't look bad. Then he had just an awful and kind of short camp last year. Lo and behold, he's a scratch. Lehigh Valley. Then they move him in a minor trade. I think that Lazinski is kind of teetering on that too. I think if he doesn't get moving quickly, then I think he moves on.
It's almost a shame for Lazinski too, because he's such a nice guy.
Yeah.
And I think he's a guy that we were rooting for. He was nice enough to hop on our show last summer. Super, super nice guy. And we forget to mention him, I think, when we're looking at the Flyers roster these days, we forget Tanner Lazinski. And I think that you're right. He might need a change of scenery, unfortunately, because like I mentioned, he is such a nice guy.
Nice guy and physically strong, and he can play wing. He can play center. He has actually pretty decent touch too, decent hands. And that's the guy who I thought when he left college was pretty darn close to being NHL ready. And then he just, although he's done it at the American League level, has not done at the NHL level. And then there's when you have back-to-back hip injuries like that, where you have torn labrums on both sides, you're talking about at least a full year to be back to yourself, especially when they happen in short order. You injure one, you're rehabbing that one, then you tear the other one. That's tough, and that's why when you look at player development, there's the drafting side and there's the development side, and while they overlap to a degree, they're also separate to a large degree too. And he's been things like injuries can really set back a guy's development. Just a guy to cite another example, German Rubtsov. Now, maybe Rubtsov was never a player who was going to develop. I don't know that. But, that's a guy who came over from the Russian junior level to the Q and was doing well. But he played in the World Juniors and he broke his nose and he had a concussion. And then he had, I believe, a wrist injury. And then he goes to the Phantoms and he has 10 points in his first 13 pro games. Then he has a shoulder injury that knocks him out for the full year. A month into his second pro year, he has another shoulder injury. And then he had a wrist surgery after that. And he's never developed. Now, how much of that was injuries and how much of that was he was never going to develop? We'll never know that. No. But things like that can really throw a player's development for a loop. And a lot of guys never bounce back from it. And you can't predict that when you draft them unless they have an injury history.
Absolutely. And I'll just throw one more name out there, just out of curiosity, who could be along those lines. Maybe not so much injury, just a lot of people are high on Zaid Wisdom. And where is he? What's going on with him?
Big year for Zaid rather. Zaid, he finished spent a significant chunk of last year in the ECHL level. Another guy, he had a shoulder surgery the year before that. And, there's a way he has to play. He's a guy who has to push the envelope, be very physical, get to the net and deflect pucks in and collect rebound kind of goals. And, you can't really go by what he did with the Phantoms during the COVID year because that wasn't really the American League. That was really a watered-down American League. A lot of guys who are in junior hockey, but also a lot of guys who are pretty good AHL guys who were on the taxi squad that year. So he was competing and succeeding against kind of a little lower grade of competition than you typically see in the American League. And then he had the shoulder surgery and then came back and had a good playoff run before he turned pro. Really never got going last year with the Phantoms. So going to the ECHL gave him some more ice time. There are guys who've gone down to the ECHL though and made it work for them. Ruslan Fedotenko went on to a very long NHL career after not clicking at first with the Phantoms, going to the ECHL, dominating at that level and springboarding back to the American League, to the NHL, and then never went back down again. So it's been done. There's examples of it, and he has to work towards it. Really just a hardworking, likable kid. I think one of the things Zaid hopefully improved on this summer. I remember last year when Torts was doing his skating torture for the first couple of days. Zaid really struggled with that last year. You could see how much he was struggling with the skating side of it. Because there's a level of conditioning in junior hockey, and you work hard and you think and you may be in the best condition of your life, but you might not still be at the NHL level yet, as conditioning wise. Mason Millman also, I think he was cramping up on the first day of camp last year and just like laying on the floor beside the rink. You can see some of these guys who are used to the junior grind and not used to the professional expectations. I think that was a good learning experience for Zaid. I expect him to be with the Phantoms this year, maybe in the bottom sixth, but this is a big year. If he has another year where he's on the AHL, ECHL bubble, then I'd start to get concerned.
For sure. Trav, you got a pretty good picture of, I guess that was Mason Millman that was laying on the ice?
Mine was Michael Houchette. He got cut pretty early. He was a camp invite from the Ramparts.
Yeah, that was pretty good. And I think everyone will remember that.
I think everybody knows that picture, yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty good. Bill, we asked you for 15 minutes. You hung out with us for about a little over half an hour. We appreciate your time.
Always a pleasure, guys.
Obviously, all of our listeners. Go ahead. Did you have one more thing there?
No, I really appreciate the analysis. I've been following you since I know you're still on Hockey Buzz, but I think the first prospect I read about was a very brand new Nick Albay-Kubel, and just the stat updates you used to give. It got me into prospects hardcore, so it's always a pleasure talking to some young guys with you.
Anytime. Always happy to do it.
Thank you, Bill.